So the talks are not really telling you what you have to do. They're not telling you you have to live a certain way or be a certain way, think a certain way, act a certain way. The talks are describing dynamics, describing mechanisms, describing life. So if a leaf is falling off a tree and we say the leaf is falling to the ground, it is a description of what's happening. In the teaching, one of the concepts, for example, is the flow of life. That means circumstance, whatever is in each moment, is either pleasure or pain relative to the individual experiencing life. So that's a description that life is sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain. So if you're listening to the radio and your favorite song comes on, that's the flow of life, that's circumstance in that moment. That is the outcome in that moment, is the song playing is the outcome. And if it's a song you like, that's pleasure in the moment. And if the announcer is talking and there's adverts and there's no music that you'd like to listen to, then you could say that's not in line with your biological preference, and so it's pain in the moment. So that's a description that life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. That the flow of life, meaning circumstance, meaning daily life in each present moment, is either pleasure or pain. That's a description, and it's really fundamental to us understanding life more clearly, especially when it comes to happiness for the human being. I say that because most people live life expecting life or hoping for life, trying to make life into pleasure, 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 pleasure. And there's this movement to try and control life so that it is pleasure, 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 because we are convinced that our happiness, which essentially means our completeness or a sense of comfort in life, the time when everything will seem okay, will be experienced as okay, where there's a sense of contentment, a sense of fulfillment. The assumption is that that will happen or that will be available when life is pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And so there is a desperateness to turn life into that. Now, another description is you can't turn life into whatever you want. Life is this big thing that turns up in each moment. And it's sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. That, I would say, is a very accurate description of life, the flow of life, when it comes to happiness for the human being. It's an accurate description and an important one. Why? Because people are spending their life, humans are spending their life trying to make life into pleasure, 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 when in fact life will be what life is, which is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. So I think I'm going to keep this satsang short because I want to deliver a singular message for consideration. The flow of life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. Now, one of the key concepts about human happiness is that my happiness is not to be found in outcomes. My happiness is not to be found in pleasure or pain. What that statement really means is that my happiness is available irrespective of what is happening in the flow of life, on the very simple basis or because of a very particular fact. And that is that happiness for the human being is available in the form of peace of mind. And peace of mind, just like the opposite of peace of mind, is always to be found in our attitude to the flow of life. So if someone has the idea that they need life to be pleasure, 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 and that they need to make life pleasure, 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 and that the other needs to assist in the mission of making life pleasure, 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 that's the idea that, let's say, we wake up with until life changes the idea. It's not just an idea, it's our sense of self. My happiness will be found in life being pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So that becomes the mission. And what then happens is when life is as it is always going to be, its nature is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, the attitude towards the pain part of life has to be one of no. So the attitude towards life when it is painful is an attitude of psychological resistance, meaning a non-acceptance, a okayness. We actually believe life is broken. When we really look at it, our conviction is life should be pleasure, 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 pleasure. I need to make it pleasure, 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 pleasure. You need to help me make it pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So that becomes the standard. That becomes the benchmark. So as soon as life delivers some pain, some outcomes that we would prefer weren't the way that they turn out, the attitude is an attitude of, no, this shouldn't be like this. And it is an attack on my idea of who I am. And so that is suffering. And it's not because of the pain of life. It's not because of the circumstance, but because of our attitude to the circumstance. The shift can be when our attitude to the circumstance, when circumstance is painful, is an attitude that says, yes, this is life unfolding. Yes, this is life working. Yes, this is an expression of the nature of life. I hammered my finger today and have a blood blister. It's pain in the moment. These things happen. Life wasn't suddenly malfunctioning. And when the attitude that we have towards pleasure or pain is that it is just pleasure or pain, that it is not a definition of who I am, that my sense of self, my sense of completeness is not linked to whether life is pleasure or pain. When our attitude to pleasure or pain is, it is painful. I did lose money, for example. I did hurt my finger, for example. The food wasn't good, for example. So there's no denying that that is not as ideal as, let's say, the alternative. We don't know that the alternative would ultimately be better, because something that appears not so good in this moment may turn out to be the foundation of something very beneficial. But if we take it as the experience in the moment, we say, yes, relative to my biological preferences, it is painful, but it's not an attack on who I am. It's not a diminishment of my sense of self. However, it's experienced as if it is, if the deeply ingrained psychological me that believes it will one day be complete when life is magically transformed into a life that is no longer a life that by nature is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. It's a life that by nature is pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. When that's our psychological sense of self, then the response has to be one of that is an attack on who I am. What's important is it is just a belief of who I am, but it's so deeply ingrained that when life and the belief come together, they create a result, they create a feeling, and that feeling is a feeling of uncomfortableness with oneself. And that uncomfortableness is a result of the psychological self feeling attacked. Now that thinking, the belief that my happiness is to be found in outcome, the belief that I am the doer and the other is the doer, is the foundation of the psychological me, and it's what we can call the thinking mind. And all of the subsequent feelings and thoughts, stories that arise from that foundation, that are usually horizontal in time, resenting and regretting what has happened in the past, looking forward into the future with expectations of how life needs to be in order for it to be okay, worried about how things will turn out, and with the attitude of complaining about the present moment. All of that we can call the thinking mind. And the thinking mind is the same as the psychological me. The psychological me doesn't exist except as it arises in the form of the thinking mind. And happiness for the human being is the dissolving, the permanent dismantling of the psychological me, the annihilation of the me. And the me is a belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and that I'm the doer and the other is the doer. But it's a belief that's so deeply ingrained, as I said, when that deeply ingrained belief interacts with life, which it always is if it's in place, then the response is this commentary of the thinking mind. And the thinking mind has issues with everyone and with everything. And it's involved. It thinks that it needs to sort things out instead of just walking away. The thinking mind can't walk away. If it walks away out of fear. That's when the thinking mind tends to walk away, when it's afraid of confrontation. So it walks away and then it thinks consistently about what it is the other person did that made the me feel inadequate or scared, and then has a story about it and perpetuates it for a long, long time. And when the psychological me dissolves, we find that we go with the flow, which really means moving from one moment to the next, letting things go. Like, oh, it's not important. That happened a long time ago. What do you mean it happened a long time ago? It was 5 minutes ago. I raised my voice at you, so I'm saying sorry. Oh, I appreciate the apology, but don't worry, that was a long time ago. Because it was let go. If we start to observe life and it clicks, yes, life is going to be sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. We're not in control of the weather. We're not in control of so many physical aspects of life. We're not in control of the other and what they do and what they don't do. We're not even, when we think about it and when we look at it, in control of our own actions and our own thoughts and our own feelings. I mean, if we were in control of all of these things, we wouldn't create anxiety and uncomfortableness and have experience of life that feels very uncomfortable. So it shows us that not even our own functioning is in our control. So that's why life is going to be sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, because there's all these factors that are out of our control. And so those factors are going to manifest as a particular experience in each moment, a particular circumstance in each moment. It might be someone cutting you off. Now, you weren't in control of the person cutting you off in a conversation or on the road, whatever it happens to be. And so, because that's not in line with your biological preferences, it's what we can call pain in the moment. And so we can see life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. It's unavoidable. You're going to be out walking and it's going to rain when you didn't expect it. And it's going to be cold, for example. So in that moment, it's going to be pain in the moment. You'll go to a restaurant and you'll get a fantastic meal beyond your expectations. Pleasure in the moment. You'll go to the movies and it'll be a good movie or a bad movie. Pleasure or pain in the moment. Once this really clicks, and it's no good, the thing is, it's no good listening to the descriptions and thinking we get it. Oh yeah, I get it. Because it makes sense. What needs to happen is we need to find a movement of actually registering for ourselves in our own experience the actual pleasure and pain of life as it unfolds. And as we're registering it, we need to register it with the concept. Oh yes, let's see, I missed the bus. It's pain in the moment. I got a cold. Pain in the moment. The cost of my holiday ticket doubled overnight. Pain in the moment. A friend surprises us and comes into town. Pleasure in the moment. Someone compliments you on something that you've done. Pleasure in the moment. Someone criticizes you for something you've done. Pain in the moment. And so if these things happen and the thought arises, this is pleasure in the moment, this is pain in the moment. My happiness isn't to be found in pleasure or pain. My happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. The flow of life means the ever-changing circumstance. And so in each moment, there is a circumstance that will then change to the next circumstance in the next moment. And so if we stub our toe, we can go into habitually the story, the psychological thinking about this, and the thought can arise, your happiness isn't to be found in pleasure or pain, which can bring us back to a quietness, to a groundedness. This is the second part of the equation. It's all well and good to have the concept that my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life, and the reason that is put forward is to tie in with the fact that life is always going to be a mix of pleasure and pain, not in our control. That's destiny unfolding. The habit of the psychological me is to be convinced that happiness is to be found in life being pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. The deepening of the understanding that life by default, by its nature, has to be sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. That goes in. So when the habit kicks in that says, why did this happen this way? And a feeling that this is an attack on who I am, the thought could arise and say, it's impersonal, that there is pain in the moment. That is destiny unfolding. And my happiness isn't to be found in circumstance, which can allow us to drop out of the story, to drop out of the narrative. And maybe connect with a deeper part of who we are. And that deeper part is the sense of I am, I exist, I already am. Whereas the psychological me says, I will be, I will become. One day I will become. One day I will be at home. How many of you have this idea that let me just get this sorted, let me just achieve this, and then everything will be okay. Then I can relax. Now, there's nothing wrong with achieving things and partaking in activities. That's a given. We need to do that, but not with the expectation that that will deliver my happiness. So let's remember to be first and foremost, which means to recognize that free of the psychological me, I am. The ingrained, that feeling of uncomfortableness that arises in the form of guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation, which is sort of like a habitual, continuous storyline. If it's very deep, we might not be able to find this I am, because we sort of will stop and we'll say, okay, I'm not thinking about the future or thinking about the past. I'm just here now, and yet it feels full of an uncomfortableness. And my suggestion is that that is the deeply ingrained guilt and shame, expectation and worry that is pervading the system, even when there isn't a conscious thought that we can see. And the way that that gets addressed, if it's going to be addressed, it's not something we're in control of, is if it's going to change, it's going to change by our attitude changing on the outer level first, which means on the in the present moment when something specifically goes wrong, and there is a very obvious commentary about that, to see that as a happening, to see the commentary as a happening, maybe to see the circumstance as a happening, and then that commentary about the circumstance can collapse. And as we find ourselves being more silent, really, in the present moment, then towards circumstances that are happening, then the deeply ingrained belief in doership and attachment to outcome starts to get loosened up, starts to dissolve. So this is a reminder to be aware of the commentary of the psychological me. The commentary and the feeling. And the feelings of uncomfortableness, when we really look at them, are really condensed thought, a narrative, a story about life. And so the question that we need to ask ourselves when we see this thinking, when we see these feelings about certain circumstances, we can ask ourselves, who cares? So it's a double-pronged statement. Who cares? It's like, who cares? Who is the entity that cares? And the answer is, it's the psychological me that is so concerned about what the other did, so concerned about what I did in the past, so concerned about what might happen in the future. It's always the psychological me. And the psychological me at its foundation is the belief in personal doership. And I am the one that made that happen, so I'm not good enough if the outcome was painful, or I'm the one that made it happen, and if the outcome is pleasurable, look how good I am. And that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. So the psychological me is craving for a soulmate, or craving for a better living environment. And we have to ask ourselves, who cares? Who cares about all that? And we'll find it's the psychological me that cares. And as our attitude towards the pleasure and pain of life changes, because we start grounding into our own essence, into the I amness that is prior to any thinking, the I amness that pervades the present moment, the I amness that is the core of this experience. As we ground in that, then the who cares, which is who cares, becomes who cares that the glass broke? Who cares that I hit my finger? Like, as in, not who ? It's like, now it's who cares ? As in, who cares? It's not important. And the third derivation of who cares is who cares? And that is different from the first who, which is who ? cares. It's still who ? cares. It's another who ? cares. And that is, there is no one that did that. The seeing is that there is no separate individual entity that speaks. There is no separate individual entity that thinks. The thinking happens as a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. A very complex biological instrument finds itself in a very complex circumstance, and thought arises because of things that we see, smell, hear, taste, or touch. Things that were not in our control to see, smell, taste, hear, or touch. And as that information comes in, the brain processes it and creates a thought, creates words, creates a biological response. And all of that is automatic, and there is no one doing it. And so when we see the narrative about, which is the psychological me caring about, can you believe what this person said to me? And we could say, like I would say, who said that to you? Jane said it to me. You know, she said I had no right to be here. Say, who said that to you? I told you, Jane. No, who? Who is Jane? A biological instrument designed by life, functioning exactly according to the design, said it as a response to the circumstance they found themselves in. There is no doer. There is just a happening in the moment, a biological instrument designed according to its genes and up-to-date conditioning to function exactly the way that it functioned. That was destiny unfolding. It was your destiny to be told that you had no right to be there, and it was their destiny to be the instrument through which life delivered your destiny. So it's impersonal. There is no separate independent entity with complete free will and autonomy that chose of their own volition to act that way and to deliver that pain to you. And the more quiet we can become, that, frankly, that's happiness for the human being, is where there just is nothing to say about what has happened. Nothing to say about what might happen. Because it becomes so blatantly obvious that what happened happened and was destined to happen that way, couldn't have happened differently. I'm not really only talking about some metaphysical destiny that has no explanation, but even from a causal unfolding point of view, A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D. And the A and the B and the C and the D are all part of impersonal physics of life, including each of our very complex bodies, are all the functioning of physics. So from the point of view of the individual, that whatever is happening in this moment is the culmination of all of these mechanics, or the singular mechanics of life, inspiring to deliver what is happening right now. A bit like the movement of a wave. The wave is continually moving forward, and the present moment is sort of like the crest of the wave. And it got put in place all the way back. You could go all the way back to the Big Bang. So I hope that there is more recognition of the fact that there is a commentary by a psychological me about all of these things that happen. And we might find this thought coming up, who cares? The psychological me is mistaken. It is not the doer. There is no doer. There never has been a doer. Even when there is the idea of a doer, a belief of a doer, that isn't the doer. So no doer means life happens. Life has always been happening. If we look at the human actions, It means the body is functioning according to its genes and up-to-date conditioning, two factors that we were not in control of. We've never been in control of. The sperm and the egg come together, it starts to grow into an organism, and that organism exists in an environment that is delivering new conditioning. And the cumulative effect of the new conditioning is what we can call our up-to-date conditioning. So in each moment, the human being is a result of the genetic structure as it stands now, and the cumulative effect of all of the new conditioning delivered to it through life. So hopefully there is a seeing of this commentary, a seeing that the psychological me believes that it is the doer, but in fact there never has been a doer. There has always been a complex biological instrument based on its genes, or that is the result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So when we realize this, we see there never has been a doer ever, anywhere, not even one single doer in life. There are, 7.5 billion people at the moment, and not one doer. Which really means a person, the 7.5 billion people, are uniquely programmed biological instruments, all functioning exactly according to their design and makeup. There has never been a doer. There will never be a doer. Included in the biological instrument, there is a psychological component, the psychological me that believes it is a doer. So the belief in personal doership doesn't make it a doer. It just creates the attitude of personal doership, the attitude towards what happens through the body as my doing, and the attitude of what happens through the other is the doing of a separate individual entity. That's the attitude towards what happens through myself and the other. It doesn't make us a doer, because doership is saying there is just a biological instrument with all of its complexity functioning. So even the feelings of love and fear are a result of that very complex biological instrument. So silence. Can happen more if there is a recognition of the thinking mind, and then a cutting off, which just reminds us to come back to the present moment outside of the story. It's like, who cares?